everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma 221 here, back in data about Märchen Crown, chapter number 2. This chapter is titled, The Curse. Bum bum ba-da-dum, or maybe I should, remove my sound effect and, put the actual sound effect of, or maybe I should just, stop going. Okay, I'll actually just, stop here. But, again, like I said, we're going to be talking about the second chapter of the Märchen Crown series today. Of course, this is the really third, but actually second chapter of the series. Be like, hey, on Manga Plus, as, of course, where I am reading this. I'm reading this on release day. It's, 11:31 when I'm sitting down and recording this video right now. So this chapter has not been out for very long whatsoever. Of course, the last chapter we got was, chapters number 0 and 1 sort of, tied in together, and this is just chapter 2, so it seems like from here on out we will just be getting a chapter every week and saying hey, get a chapter every week. It'll be a regular chapter, not 2 chapters shoved into one like that pilot chapter was, right? But anyway, this is a very interesting chapter, and honestly, going into this today, I did not know if I was going to want to cover this series. Because of course I covered it last week. It's hey, I read it live as I was sort of just sitting down and recording the video. I was hey, this may be a little bit of a fun and different type of video I can do for it. And while I was sort of going through and doing that, I was I don't know, I may cover the series, I may not. I mean, I, of course, read Aka Asakasa's last series that they wrote, of course, Oshinoko, and absolutely loved and adored that series. Covered it for, just over 60 chapters, just over a third of that series or so. And here's what my sort of philosophy has come to. This series definitely seems like it is going to be more of a, dark horror series, not as much of the romance series that was sort of being blended into before, and that's really fine. I'm just not the biggest fan of horror-based manga in general. Granted, I have not really read enough horror manga, but really, I'll just have to see how I'm enjoying this one. And hey, if we get to 5 chapters in and I'm still covering it, I'm hey guys, I'm really just not liking this series, and hey, I don't need to keep covering it, right? I sort of think I have this problem. I'm hey, I need to talk about every single issue of Weekly Shonen Jump. If I skip one, I'm sort of losing the point of doing the series, right? But hey, I'm just going to cover the series probably up until chapter 5 or 6, maybe the first volume worth of chapters, to be hey guys, this is really what I'm thinking about this series, and if I'm not liking it, then I don't need to cover it anymore. And that's sort of just where I am here in the moment, right? But to sort of hop into this chapter itself, I am not necessarily going to talk about everything that happened last time in this series, because I really don't feel that it's very much needed. Hey, just go read the pilot chapter. It's hey, we have this girl named Rapunzel and this guy named Mikel. Rapunzel lives in a very Rapunzel-esque tower. Mikel comes up and sort of saves her from all this, and hey, there's this wicked witch who tells her not to go outside. And the whole crux of last chapter is Mikel says hey, come over to my village, you can meet all of my family members and all of that, right? Well, Rapunzel comes with him to go meet all of his family members, and they are these weird, plant, tree, vine abominations of, this very, horror-esque thing of, oh, I don't know if I particularly like how those guys look, if you know what I'm saying, right? And, of course, the end of last chapter was Mikel being oh, no, Rapunzel just ran away. And, yes, Rapunzel was running away through all of the thorns and briars, right? And, of course, we open up this chapter with, of course, hey, it's chapter 2, which means we get a second color page. It's a little bit of a nice one with, a picture frame with, Rapunzel running out from it, holding out her hand outstretched with, a bunch of vines and brambles are going around the picture frame. As, of course, we get, hey, Märchen Crown, chapter number 2, The Curse. Okay, we'll actually just, stop this joke at this point, right? The beginning of this chapter is a little bit of an interesting one, as we see that there is some sort of fire being set to a bunch of vines and brambles here in the area, as we see some knights who are very Templar-esque sort of people. They have sort of this weird 3-sword sigil on their chest plate, and we pretty much see one guy's okay, is this the last of it? Hey, I trust there are no remainders, right? As we see that one of these Dark Knights hey, no sir, we're running out of time, let's head to the last destination, inform his highness. And we see now one of these guys okay, yes sir, right? And we see as they are sort of walking through this general area, they're sort of riding around on these horses also, and we see there's a bunch of wooden either trees or just spikes or poles in the ground, and on top of all of these poles are what seem to be heads of human-type creatures with vines sprouting out of them in the moment, right? And we see all these horses sort of riding through here, and we see we really get the face of one of these men riding the horses. He's got short, sort of a messy black hair in a way, right? We see like he's got a very stern face here in a moment, but we really don't learn too much else about this guy, and I don't even know if he's one of the other knights that we see later on in this chapter, right? At this point, we cut to Rapunzel, who's of course running back to her safety of the tower through all of these various woods, and as she's sort of like just running through here, Rapunzel sort of remembers all of the words that Michael told her last time, like, hey, the reason we have to travel through the treetops is because the land surrounding your tower is covered by a thicket of thorns, right? She just remembers Michael pretty much saying, like, hey, if we travel through the ground, your legs would be covered in scratches, and Rapunzel's like, oh, okay, I mean, that makes a whole lot of sense. You're like, I see. No wonder no one was ever able to come before besides for you, Michael, right? And Michael's like, hey, I'll guide you back to the trees on your way home too, right? And Rapunzel's just like, oh, hey, thank you so very much, Michael. Like, you're just so dependable at the end of the day, right? And she even makes a little bit of like a funny note of like, hey, but I have to wonder, how does Madame Witch like actually go outside and move around? Like, do you think she can fly? And Michael's like, haha, like, there's no way she really could, right? And as we see Rapunzel's just like continuing to run through this entire thicket of the forest, she catches her foot on some of these vines and brambles, sort of like just falls down to the ground, and she sort of like hurts her face, and she just starts to like cry a bit more as we see that she's entered a little bit of a forest clearing as she sees all of the various flowers that Michael brought her to before, right? And she's like, oh my gosh, like this is a flower meadow, and she remembers all of the moments that she spent with Michael. And she really just starts to cry. She's just like, oh, like, what am I doing here? Like, why, Michael? Why did you lie to me about all of this, right? As we really cut onto her knee, where we see that she's got a little bit of a cut, and blood is pouring out of the cut in this moment, right? As we almost hear a little bit of a slitter sound effect, as we see that Rapunzel opens her eyes, and we see a bunch of vines sort of coming from all of these various flowers and moving towards the blood that is coming out of her knee and the blood that is on the ground. And as we see this, it seems like one of the flowers starts to open up and bloom as we see a small hand start to crawl out of it. And coming from the hand after that, as these vines are pouring into the blood, it seems like small babies are coming out of these flowers. This is like oh yeah, that's a little bit creepy if you know what I'm saying, right? And Rapunzel's very much just like, what is this? As we see that she just like screams extremely like, ee, like what is going on here, right? And she's like, no, 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 no. And she starts to run away even more. She just remembers what Madame Witch has told her before, like, hey, the world outside is filled with terrible, frightening things, so you must never dream of leaving this tower. And Rapunzel's like, man, Madame Witch was like completely right. Like, I'm so sorry, Madame Witch. Like, hey, I'm so sorry. So please save me. I'm begging you, right? And she's like, Madame Witch, Madame Witch. And she's like running away here in the moment. We come back over to where Michael is, and we just see that he's sort of like roaming around, like, hey, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, like, where are you? Are you around here, right? And we see he's like, well, I mean, I guess it's really no use. Like, she's not here. I mean, there's no way she ran into the thorny thicket, is there? And she just thinks like, and Michael just thinks like, I mean, why did she even run away to begin with? Like, she looked so scared too. Like, hey, it's almost nightfall. If she's in a thicket, she'll need some medicine and bandages. Like, hey, I should go back home and get some for her, right? It sort of seems like that Michael actually does care, or maybe a little bit of more of something that is really meeting the eye. We see that he is climbing back through all the bushes to go back to his home village, pretty much, right? And as we get there, we see that he opens up into the thicket, and he's like, oh my gosh, like, what in the world is going on here? As we see that all of his quote-unquote family members are impaled on the ground with all their, like, viney and weird tangly bodies and sort of, like, writhing in pain on the ground. And Michael's like, oh, like, what is going on here? Like, everyone from the village is here, but, like, why? Like, everything was fine just a moment ago, right? And he runs over, and we see that one of these creatures is still standing. And he says, like, oh, Annie, like, you're still alive. Like, is everything all right? He's like, oh, hey, like, thank goodness, like, you're still alive, right? And he's like, hey, are you okay, Annie? Like, what happened while I was just there in the forest, right? As we see that he's going through all of this stuff, right? Eventually, some person comes by with a sword and swings it into Michael's Annie, pretty much destroying this weird vine beast creature. And Michael's like, what is going on here? As we see a reflection in Michael's eye of a just regular looking human Vistage. As of course, we know this really weird plant monster that's going and falling to the ground. It's like, okay, what is going on with Michael here, right? As we pretty much see that, like, he's like, what's going on, like, Auntie? Like, what is going on here? As we see that somebody on the horse, who seems to be the person who we saw at the beginning of this chapter, is like, hey, you there. What are you doing here, young one, right? And we see that he's holding a very, like, imperial sword in his hand, like that very stern expression that we saw earlier. And we see that Michael's like, this man, like, is he a knight from the kingdom? And the knight's just like, hey, they didn't harm you, did they? And Michael's like, and the knight just says, like, hey, your safety is not yet assured. You must get away from that monster at once. And Michael's like, hey, what do you mean by, monster? This woman is my family. She's just an ordinary person. Like, she hasn't done anything wrong whatsoever. As we see it, this guy's like, oh, an ordinary person? You mean to call that thing a person? As he just takes his blade and stabs it through the mouth of this creature. And it's like, oh, I don't know if I like that visual, right? But the knight pretty much just, like, holds it on his sword and holds it toward Michael, just saying, like, hey, let me ask you now, does this look like an ordinary person to you? As Michael just starts to throw up, like, it just comes out of his mouth. He expels all this from his body and just like, oh, this isn't good, right? As this knight pretty much just says, like, oh, I see then. You appeared to be normal at a first glance, but it seems you are even more of a lost cause than they are. As we see that he swings down his sword in front of Michael, and the blood is just, like, falling from the blade as he sort of goes through and cuts Michael in the side, and we see that this guy goes and cuts Michael straight in half. And we see, like, this really weird panel of, like, Michael trying to run away, but, like, his hands outstretched and his hands behind him, but his body has just been severed in two. And the next really interesting panel of, like, Michael's blood just, like, splurring everywhere is, like, his bottom half falls to the ground and his top half falls away too, as he's like, like, what is going on here, right? As we see that this knight's just like, oh, how pitiful. As we see a few of these other Templar-like knights just walk up, and one's like, hey, Lord Krez, we've completed cleanup in this area, right? That's Lord K-R-E-U-Z, so, Krez, I'm going to say. I don't exactly know how they want me to pronounce that. I mean, maybe it's like, Kurezu, like, yeah, I think Lord Krez works pretty well, right? And this guy's like, hey, shall we return to his high highness, right? And Krez is like, hey, before that, there's one more thing to take care of. As we see that he pulls out this very ornate, like, flintlock pistol and points it down to Michael's dead body and just says, like, hey, just for safe measure, this one seems like he could give us a little bit of trouble. As he holds the flintlock in his hand and points it down at Michael's head and fires, we see that Michael's head pretty much just, like, explodes here in a moment. Like, one of his eyeballs just, like, flies off out and away, right? As Krez is just like, hey, such a crude weapon, but like, hey, by the way, that scream from earlier, it sounded like a woman, like she's likely someone who ran deep within the forest, and he's like, hey, you all go ahead and pursue her. When you find her, capture her and rally her with the main forces. And all of the knights like, hey, yes sir, Lord Krez, will do, right? As Michael is just laying on the ground, he's just like, oh, am I going to die here? Like, what about her? Will she be killed in the same way? Rapunzel. As we get a little bit of, like, a narration just coming in this moment, it says, like, hey, offer thyself, O cursed one. Offer your imprisoned soul, your shriveled husk, and your flesh and blood. Wither and decay. Your long-cherished wish shall be soon fulfilled, and the world shall be yours to plunder. O withered one, be reborn. Offer your cursed bones to the princess of the flora, and become thou a true companion. As we see in this moment, all of these vines start to sprout out from, of course, Michael's blood here, and they seem to go through and start to connect all of his various bodies together, right? We cut to a few of these knights who are scouting the forest for Rapunzel, and a few of them are like, oh, come on now, like, does he seriously want us to go into this really creepy forest? Like, can you really believe him? Like, Lord Krez is, like, he's such an awful guy. Like, he really just treats us like dirt for sure, right? One of the other knights is like, hey, but it seems like whoever's in this forest, like, is it a monster? Like, they said it was a human girl who ran in, right? And like, hey, did anyone see her? Like, I think they heard a scream or something, right? And he's like, oh, a scream? Like, hey, how can they be so sure from just a scream? Like, that boy that Lord Corez killed, like, also looked like just a normal one on the outside, but, like, he called those things his family, and he's like, hey, there are among the cursed ones whose voices and appearances don't change, though it's the first time I actually saw one. And the guy's like, hey, are you actually serious? As we see all of the vines from Michael's body going and, like, picking up his eyeball and pulling it back together, right? As we see that one of these guys is like, hey, well, either way, our job remains the same. Let's just get it over with already, right? As the other knight just is like, hey, but still, if you're saying that the cursed ones who are... If you're saying that there are cursed ones out there who appear normal, then what proof is there that you or I also aren't actually cursed? And the other guy is just like, I didn't want to think about that. As one guy's just like, haha, I'm just kidding, like, hey. And he's like, hey, that wasn't funny whatsoever. As we start to hear a little bit of a, noise approaching these two knights, as we see they get their spears and everything ready, as one of the guys is like, hey, where's that noise coming from, right? Like, hey, I'm sure we cleared out this whole area earlier, right? As they look in front of them, and they see this weird abomination of Michael's body with all of these vines holding him together, slithering towards these two Templarish knights, and they're just like, what the? And it's like, oh man, I don't know if I like this. And that's where we end this chapter of Märchen Crown, or Fairy Tale Crown, as of course we learned is what the actual chapter title means. I am very at a loss of words of really what to think on this series. On one hand, it's like, okay, I can sort of understand where this series is going. It is this weird world where there are these weird vine-like creatures. It seems like Michael is one of these creatures and who lives out in like the middle of nowhere pretty much. Like, hey, it seems that he has this sort of curse that prevents him from really understanding what he is in relation to all of these weird vine-blooming monsters, right? It seems like these monsters are also what Rapunzel has ran into, of like all of these like human babies being born. Like maybe they are born as human babies and over time their appearance changes to these weird like demonic like looking creatures. Honestly, I'm not really so sure on like what the whole lore of this whole situation is, and I'll definitely be interested to find out, and I hope that's something that gets revealed here decently soon. It's like, hey, this is the crux of the series, this is how it's going to be going. But knowing many of the other Aka Asakasa series that, of course, he has written, I know that it normally takes a volume for all of these big things to be like, okay, this is the big reveal, this is what we are getting here. And honestly, I expected more of like, hey, we are going to be getting like a lot more of this lovey-dovey stuff between Michael and Rapunzel, and eventually we get the whole idea of like, hey, this is where the crux of the series comes in. We are in this weird horror eldritch abomination with these weird plant monster things. It really reminds me of another manga running in Shonen Jump Plus right now called Wild Strawberry, who has this sort of same weird aesthetic. They call their beast Jinka, and they're like this weird like plant-based monstrosity guys who feed off of like human blood and all of that. I don't think that's where Märchen Crown is necessarily going. We also get introduced to this character of Lord Cruz, or Commander Cruz, or whatever they call him here in the chapter. What do they call him again? Yes, they call him Lord Cruz. He seems to be like the leader of all of these various other knights, and apparently they don't like him too much, but it seems like he's still like the strongest one out there, and he knows how to deal with all of these weird vine creatures. So very interesting chapter. Definitely interested to see like what Michael becomes, and of course, like, hey, it seems like the character on the front cover of the series looks a little bit different than Michael does currently, and I don't know if that's just because like, hey, they were drawn in a different way, or like Rapunzel's actually going to find a different sort of Prince Charming here in the moment, and that is really where the series is going to go. And it's like, hey, avoiding all of these weird eldritch monstrosities. We really don't know too much about this series, so I will be intrigued to cover it next time. Again, this was Märchen Crown chapter number 2. I did a video covering chapter number 1 last week, so you can go check that out on the YouTube channel. It's very easily and readily available. I also cover some other anime manga type series, so hey, if you like Weekly Shonen Jump or any of the other manga series out there, check my channel. I may talk about them at some point. You never really know, right? But really, fine chapter of Märchen Crown. Like I said, I'm definitely interested to see where the series goes next time, and yeah, it definitely seems like a lot less of the romance we were promised and a lot more of the, oh, that is an eldritch vine creature horror. But yeah, with all that out of the way, thank you guys so very much for watching, and I'll be catching you guys next time. Again, this was Märchen Crown chapter number 2, titled The Curse, which is apparently what Mikel has. We're not really so sure. But yeah, I'll be catching you guys next time. This is Glowplasma 231, signing out.